Have you ever wondered how to answer why our efforts cannot earn salvation? Well, Jesus shared the marriage feast parable with a little deeper interpretation about God's requirement of absolute righteousness. Let's begin the parable at Matthew chapter 22, verse 2 to 4. The kingdom of heaven can be illustrated by the story of a king who had prepared a great wedding feast for his son. When the banquet was ready, he sent his servants to notify those who were invited, but they all refused to come. So he sent other servants to tell them, "The feast has been prepared, the bulls and fattened cattle have been killed, everything is ready, come to the banquet." Now this parable begins with the character being a king, referring someone with all the power, authority, and resources, also known as God. This king's beloved son is about to be married, so he prepares a great feast and sends out servants to inform those invited, but those invited refuse. This speaks of God sending his only son, Jesus, to God's chosen people, the Jews, which were the very people Jesus was telling this parable to. However, those present weren't truly listening to discern the parable of the son and the wedding feast, which pointed to Jesus and the Father's salvation plan. Everything already prepared for them, with the only requirement being to accept the invitation. However, they still rejected the king's generosity, despite his very best royal standard provided and sincere appeal to just come to the banquet. Let's continue with verse 5 to 7. But the guests he had invited ignored them and went their own way. One to his farm, another to his business, others seized his messengers, insulted them, and killed them. The king was so furious, he sent out his army to destroy the murderers and burn their town. The guests ignored the messengers by going their own way, can speak of depending on our own self-effort rather than depending on the king's generosity and sacrifice to enjoy his eternal provision. The parable continues that others seized the messengers, insulted them, and even murdered them, referring to the prophets of past whom the Jews had rejected and murdered, resulting in their destruction and exile. Friends, we can also be similarly caught up with our own self, that we need reminders to seek Jesus as the cornerstone of wisdom and direction. We continue with verse 8. And he said to his servants, "The wedding feast is ready, and the guests I invited aren't worthy of the honor. Now go out to the street corners and invite everyone you see." So the servants brought in everyone they could find, good and bad alike, and the banquet hall was filled with guests. The king's initial invite was to the Jews who were given the law, knowing good from evil, which underpinned their righteousness and acceptance to their own performance. Despite being made worthy to receive it, they failed to meet the requirements by being unfaithful and rejected the king's invite to come to the Son. Then God opened the doors to everyone who were the non-Jews, also known as Gentiles, people like you and I, the good and bad alike. Both Jews and Gentiles were invited to experience the Son, but only the second group came. Verse 11 to 14. But when the king came in to meet the guests, he noticed a man who wasn't wearing the proper clothes for a wedding. "Friend," he asked, "how is it that you are here without wedding clothes?" But the man had no reply. Then the king said to his aides, "Bind his hands and feet and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen." Do you feel confused at the king's actions? On one hand, the king seems so generous with an open invite to everyone and throws someone out without wedding clothes. I'd like to submit that the proper wedding clothes here speak of how we approach God. How he sees our attire that covers us determines our acceptance to God. In other words, the only way we can approach a holy God is if we are clothed in righteousness. The second group, being the good and bad alike, had to be dressed appropriately for the wedding of the king's son. The man who was not dressed properly for the wedding was not allowed to be at the wedding party. Then, who can be good enough? Friends, regardless of the first or second group, Jew or Gentile, the only acceptable attire fit for a royal wedding was if God provided it. Hence, in order to be accepted by God, they needed to take on the robe of righteousness that Jesus provided on the cross. Justification by faith, not works. In conclusion, the parable is about how God has prepared a salvation plan through His Son, which was first offered to the Jews but rejected. Then the Gentiles were invited to come to the Son, but with the only qualification to enjoy the feast by being clothed in God's accepted form of righteousness. His own perfect robe of righteousness was provided by Jesus on the cross when we accepted His sacrifice as the divine exchange, that is, receiving the Son's sinless state while taking on our sins on the cross. Aren't you glad Jesus provided His righteous robe to attend His wedding? Now we come to the time of discussion questions. Number one, what was the lesson that Jesus was teaching through this parable? Number two, why did the king not accept the guests without proper wedding clothes? Number three, share a time in your life you felt rejected, but God turned the situation around by reminding your acceptance in Jesus' righteousness. Be blessed.